If you're going to pretend to be my wife, you have to kiss me like you mean it." The words barely left Ethan Carter's lips before the entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing. Crystal chandeliers casting warm golden light over 100 stunned faces as Olivia Bennet stood frozen in front of him, her fingers trembling ever so slightly against the sleeve of his tailored black tuxedo, the soft hum of string music fading into a distant blur, while every camera, every whisper, every curious glance locked onto them like gravity had shifted, and they were suddenly the center of it all. And for a split second Ethan hesitated, not because of the audience, not because of the act they had rehearsed so carefully over the past 72 hours, but because something in her eyes felt dangerously real, something familiar, something that didn't belong in a contract built on rules and distance and temporary lies. Yet before doubt could catch up with him, he closed the space between them and pressed his lips gently against hers. A kiss meant to convince a room full of skeptics, but landing somewhere far deeper than performance. And the crowd erupted into applause, laughter, approving nods. Exactly as expected, exactly as planned, except nothing about the way his hand lingered at her waist felt like part of the deal, and nothing about the way Olivia's breath caught against his collarbone felt rehearsed. And in that moment the line between pretend and something dangerously close to truth blurred beyond recognition. Because 3 days ago none of this existed, not the whispers, not the champagne glasses clinking under golden lights, not the weight of a diamond ring resting on her finger like it belonged there, and certainly not the way Ethan Carter, CEO of Carter Holdings, a man known for control and calculation, found himself unable to look away from a woman he had hired to play a role, because 72 hours earlier he had been standing in his glass-walled office overlooking Manhattan, tie loosened, phone buzzing non-stop with messages from his sister about her wedding, each one sharper than the last, each one reminding him of the one thing he didn't have: a partner, a name to present, someone to silence the questions and expectations that followed him into every room. And that's when the idea had come: clean, simple, transactional, find someone, make it believable, get through the weekend, no complications, no emotions, just a contract. And somehow that plan had led him to Olivia Bennet, a woman who walked into his life with quiet confidence wrapped in second-hand elegance, a woman who agreed to the terms without hesitation, yet carried something in her presence that made even the most controlled man feel slightly off balance. And now here they were, standing under golden light, applause still echoing around them, her hand still in his, the ring catching reflections from every angle, a perfect illusion for everyone watching. Except Ethan Carter couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't where the story began, and as he pulled back just enough to look into her eyes again, something unspoken passed between them, something that didn't belong to a contract, something that felt like a memory trying to surface. And for the first time since this arrangement began, Ethan realized with a quiet, unsettling certainty that this woman, standing in front of him, might not be a stranger at all, and whatever truth was waiting beneath this carefully constructed lie was about to change everything. 72 hours earlier, the city had looked colder, sharper, less forgiving. As Ethan Carter stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his midtown office watching headlights crawl through evening traffic like distant fireflies, his reflection staring back at him with the same controlled expression he had perfected over the years, the kind that did not reveal pressure, did not reveal expectation, did not reveal the quiet exhaustion of being a man everyone needed something from. And yet his phone would not stop vibrating against the glass desk behind him, his sister's name flashing again and again until he finally turned, picked it up, and answered with a calm that sounded almost rehearsed. "I told you I will be there, Ava," he said. But her voice came through fast, emotional, layered with the kind of urgency only family could carry, reminding him that this wedding was not just another event, not just another obligation, but a moment where all eyes would turn to him, where questions would follow him from table to table, where every relative, every business partner, every quiet observer would ask the same thing in different ways. Why are you still alone? Who stands beside you? What does it say about a man who can build an empire, but cannot build a life? And Ethan closed his eyes briefly, exhaling through his nose as he leaned back against the desk, because the truth was simple and inconvenient. He did not have anyone, not someone he trusted, not someone who had stayed, not someone who saw him without seeing his last name first. And that was when the idea formed, not out of desperation but out of logic, clean and efficient. Like every decision he had ever made, he did not need love. He needed a solution, someone presentable, someone believable, someone who could stand beside him for one weekend and disappear without complication. And within the hour, his assistant had arranged a private meeting through a discreet agency that specialized in exactly that kind of arrangement. No questions, no entanglements, just contracts and expectations clearly defined. And that was how Olivia Bennet walked into his life, not with drama, not with hesitation, but with a quiet steadiness that immediately disrupted the simplicity of his plan. She wore a navy dress that was elegant but not extravagant, her posture straight, her gaze calm but observant, as if she was taking in more than she let on. And when she sat across from him in the private conference room overlooking the Hudson River, she did not fidget, did not rush, did not try to impress. She simply listened as he explained the terms: 3 days, public appearances, family interactions, a fixed compensation, strict boundaries, no emotional expectations. And when he finished, expecting questions or negotiation, she surprised him by nodding once and saying, "I understand." Her voice steady, clear, unshaken, and something about that response lingered longer than it should have, because most people reacted to him, adjusted themselves around his presence. But Olivia did not. She remained exactly who she was. And when he slid the contract across the table along with a small velvet box containing the ring that would complete the illusion, she looked at it for a moment, her fingers brushing lightly over the surface as if recognizing something deeper than the object itself, before signing her name without hesitation. And as she handed the pen back to him, their fingers almost touched. A brief, accidental moment that should have meant nothing, yet for reasons he could not explain, Ethan felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, something that did not belong in a transaction. And as she stood to leave, offering a polite, professional smile, he found himself watching her just a second longer than necessary, a subtle pause that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by him, because for the first time in a very long time, a decision that had been perfectly logical did not feel entirely under his control. The first rule of pretending to belong in someone else's world is simple: do not let them see you learning. And Olivia Bennet repeated that quietly to herself as the black car slowed to a smooth stop in front of the Carter family estate, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her dress as she took in the scene through the tinted window, the sprawling property stretching across acres of perfectly manicured lawn, white stone columns rising against the soft afternoon sky, everything about it polished, deliberate, effortless in a way that only came from generations of wealth. And for a brief second her reflection stared back at her in the glass, composed on the outside, steady, controlled, but her grip tightened just slightly as she exhaled, reminding herself that this was not her world and it did not need to be. She only had to play her part, just 3 days, just a role, just a contract. And yet the weight of the ring on her finger felt heavier than it should have, catching the light as if it belonged there, as if it had always been hers. And that thought unsettled her more than anything else, because nothing about this was supposed to feel natural, not the luxury, not the attention, and certainly not the man sitting beside her, Ethan Carter, who adjusted his cufflinks with the same calm precision he carried into every room, his presence steady, controlled, unreadable, except for the occasional glance he gave her, quick, assessing, as if he was trying to place something he could not quite name. And when the driver opened the door, the air shifted instantly, voices in the distance, laughter drifting from the backyard where preparations were already underway, and Ethan stepped out first, extending his hand without hesitation, a silent cue, a reminder of the role they had agreed to play, and Olivia placed her hand in his, her movements smooth, practiced, matching his pace as if they had done this 100 times before, and the moment their fingers intertwined, something in the dynamic changed, subtle but undeniable, because it no longer felt like guidance, it felt like connection, and that was dangerous territory for something built entirely on boundaries. As they walked toward the entrance, the doors opened before they reached them, staff greeting them with polite nods, and inside the house the atmosphere shifted into something warmer, filled with voices and movement, and the kind of familiarity that comes from people who have known each other for years, and almost immediately the attention turned toward them. Conversations slowing, eyes tracking, curiosity rising, and Olivia felt it, the silent evaluation, the unspoken questions. Who is she? Where did she come from? What does she bring into this family? And for a fraction of a second the pressure pressed in on her chest, but she did not falter, because she had already decided something important the moment she signed that contract. She would not play this role as someone pretending to be worthy. She would play it as someone who already was. And beside her, Ethan seemed to notice the shift, his grip tightening ever so slightly, not in control, not in direction, but in something that felt closer to reassurance. And when his sister approached with a bright smile and curious eyes, greeting them with warmth but scanning Olivia carefully, waiting for something to break the illusion, Olivia smiled back with calm confidence, meeting her gaze without hesitation, her voice steady as she introduced herself. And for the first time since this arrangement began, the line between performance and truth blurred again, because nothing about her felt forced, nothing about her felt out of place. And as Ethan watched that exchange unfold, he felt that same unsettling flicker from before return stronger than ever, because the way she carried herself, the way she spoke, the quiet strength beneath her composure, it all felt familiar in a way that made no logical sense. And as the afternoon light filtered through the tall windows and laughter resumed around them, Ethan Carter realized with a quiet, growing certainty that bringing Olivia Bennett into his world had already complicated far more than a single weekend could contain. In this family, impressions are everything, and first impressions last forever. A woman's voice said smoothly from behind a glass of champagne, the words light on the surface but carrying just enough weight to land exactly where they were meant to, and Olivia Bennett did not need to turn around to know she had just been measured, categorized, and quietly challenged all at once, because the tone was familiar, the kind that smiled while testing your place in a room you were never expected to belong to. And when she did turn, she found a woman standing just a few feet away, elegant in a pale designer dress, posture perfect, gaze sharp with a confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was in this world, and more importantly, who everyone else was supposed to be. Sophia Lang. The woman introduced herself, though the slight pause before her name suggested she expected recognition. And when Ethan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly beside Olivia, that was confirmation enough. An ex-fiancée, a history, a complication that had not been written into any contract. And yet Olivia simply smiled, extending her hand with the same calm composure she had carried since stepping into this house. Olivia Bennett, she replied, her voice steady, warm without yielding, and the brief contact between their hands felt less like a greeting and more like a silent negotiation, one that did not need words to establish that neither of them intended to step back. And for a moment the space between them held a quiet tension, the kind that most people would try to soften, but Olivia did not look away, did not shrink, did not overcompensate. She simply remained exactly as she was, and that alone shifted the balance more than any response could have, because people like Sophia expected reaction, expected insecurity, expected proof that they held the advantage, and when none of that appeared, her smile sharpened just slightly. I did not realize Ethan was bringing someone new, she said, her tone carefully neutral, but the implication clear, and before Ethan could step in, before he could redirect or control the conversation the way he always did, Olivia spoke first. Sometimes the most important things happen when you are not expecting them, she said softly, meeting Sophia's gaze without hesitation, and something about the simplicity of that response landed deeper than any defensive explanation would have, because it was not an excuse, it was a statement, and for a brief second even Sophia seemed to reconsider her approach, her eyes narrowing just slightly before she let out a small, polite laugh and lifted her glass. Well, I suppose surprises do keep life interesting, she replied, though the undertone remained, and as she stepped away into the crowd, the tension dissolved into the surrounding conversation, leaving behind a subtle shift in the atmosphere that only a few would notice. And beside Olivia, Ethan exhaled quietly, his attention still following Sophia for a moment before returning to the woman at his side, studying her with a depth that had nothing to do with their arrangement. Because what he had just witnessed was not performance. It was instinct. It was composure under pressure, It was the kind of quiet strength that did not need to prove itself, and that realization unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. "You handled that well," he said finally, his voice lower now, less formal, and Olivia allowed herself a small, almost amused smile. "I thought that was part of the job," she replied, though there was a lightness in her tone that had not been there before. And as the music resumed and conversations flowed around them once again, Ethan found himself watching her just a second longer than necessary, because the more he saw, the less this felt like something he had arranged, and the more it felt like something he was beginning to lose control over, not in the way that threatened his world, but in the way that quietly rewrote it. And somewhere beneath the surface of polite smiles and practiced roles, something real was beginning to take shape, whether either of them was ready for it or not. The moment you realize you are no longer acting is the moment everything becomes dangerous, and Olivia Bennet felt that shift not in a single dramatic instant, but in the quiet spaces between conversations as the afternoon unfolded, in the way Ethan's hand remained at the small of her back just a second longer than necessary when guiding her through the crowd, in the way his voice softened slightly when he spoke only to her, and in the way people began to look at them not with curiosity anymore, but with acceptance, as if the illusion had settled into something believable, something real enough to stop questioning. And that was exactly what they were supposed to achieve, yet it was also the one thing their agreement had warned against, because believability required a level of closeness that blurred lines neither of them had intended to cross. And as they moved into the garden where long tables were set beneath strings of warm lights, laughter rising into the early evening air, Olivia found herself adjusting naturally to the rhythm of the environment, responding to conversations, offering polite observations, even laughing softly at a story told by one of Ethan's relatives. And each interaction built the image they had agreed to present, but it also revealed something else, something that could not be rehearsed, her ability to belong without trying too hard, without overcompensating, without losing herself in the process. And Ethan noticed every detail. The way she listened more than she spoke, the way she remembered names after hearing them once, the way she handled subtle tests without ever appearing defensive. And with each passing moment the certainty he had carried into this arrangement began to unravel quietly, because this was no longer just a solution. It was becoming something unpredictable, something that required attention not as a strategy, but as a feeling. And that was unfamiliar territory for a man who built his life on control. And when dinner was announced, and they took their seats at a long table filled with family and close friends, the atmosphere shifted again into something more intimate, more observant, conversations overlapping, glasses clinking softly, and across from them Sophia sat with composed elegance, her gaze occasionally drifting toward Olivia, measuring, recalculating, as if searching for a flaw that had not yet revealed itself. And beside her a man leaned in, whispering something that made her smile faintly, a reminder that she was not the only one capable of navigating this world with precision. And Olivia felt that attention without needing to meet it directly, because she had already decided she would not play defense in a space where she had every right to stand. And when a question came from the far end of the table, light in tone but deliberate in intent, asking how she and Ethan had met, the conversation paused just enough for the answer to matter. And for a brief second Ethan turned to her, giving her the choice, a silent acknowledgement that this part of the story belonged to her as much as it did to him. And Olivia met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them before she spoke, with a calm ease that felt both natural and intentional. "We met when neither of us was looking for anything," she said, her voice steady, her expression soft but certain, and a quiet murmur of approval moved through the table, because the answer was simple, elegant, and just vague enough to satisfy curiosity without inviting deeper questions. And Ethan felt something shift again at her words, because while they fit perfectly within the boundaries of their agreement, they also carried a truth he could not ignore. And as the evening continued under the glow of soft lights and quiet laughter, Ethan Carter realized that somewhere between strategy and performance, Olivia Bennet had become more than a role. And the more that realization settled in, the harder it became to remember where the contract ended and something real had begun. Sometimes it is not what people say that reveals the truth, but what they notice without meaning to. And for Ethan Carter, that moment came quietly, almost invisibly, in the middle of a conversation that had nothing to do with Olivia, and yet somehow led straight back to her. As one of his uncles began recounting an old family tradition about summer gatherings by a lake house in upstate New York, describing early mornings, the smell of coffee in the air, the sound of water lapping against the dock, and it should have been just another story, just another polite moment to nod and smile. But as Ethan listened, he felt something shift beside him, subtle but unmistakable, because Olivia's posture changed ever so slightly, her attention sharpening not out of obligation but recognition. And when she spoke, her voice soft but clear, adding a small detail about how the mist over the water tends to lift right after sunrise, revealing the reflection of the trees in a way that makes everything feel still for just a moment. The table went quiet in that brief, almost imperceptible way that happens when someone says something too real to ignore, and Ethan turned toward her, studying her with a focus that cut through everything else, because that detail was not something people guessed. It was something they remembered, something they had lived, and yet he had never told her about that place, never mentioned it in any conversation, never written it into any version of their fabricated story, and the realization settled slowly, but firmly, creating a ripple of unease beneath his otherwise controlled exterior. "You have been there?" he asked, his tone measured but edged with curiosity that he could not fully hide. And Olivia paused for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of something passing through her expression before she smiled lightly. "Places like that tend to feel familiar even if you have not seen them before," she replied, her answer smooth, almost poetic, and perfectly positioned to deflect without denying. And the conversation resumed around them, laughter returning, glasses lifting, but Ethan no longer heard it the same way, because his attention remained fixed on her, on the small inconsistencies that were beginning to form a pattern he could not ignore, the way she held her fork with quiet precision that matched formal etiquette but did not feel practiced, the way she navigated conversations with an ease that suggested experience rather than preparation, and most of all, the way certain moments seemed to pull something from her that she quickly covered, as if she was revealing more than she intended, and then carefully stepping back. And for the first time since this arrangement began, Ethan felt something unfamiliar press against the edges of his control, not doubt exactly, but curiosity layered with something deeper, something that felt uncomfortably close to recognition. And as the evening stretched on and the sky deepened into shades of blue and gold, he found himself replaying every interaction, every word, every glance, searching for a connection he could not yet define. Because Olivia Bennett was no longer just a solution to a problem, she was becoming a question, one that did not have an easy answer. And as she turned toward him again, smiling softly at something someone else had said, the light catching in her eyes in a way that felt both present and distant at the same time, Ethan Carter realized with a quiet certainty that whatever story he thought he was controlling had already begun to write itself in ways he did not expect, and the more he paid attention, the more it felt like he was not meeting someone new, but remembering someone he had somehow forgotten. There are moments when silence says more than any question ever could, and that night, long after the laughter faded and the last of the guests drifted back inside, Ethan Carter found himself standing alone on the wide terrace overlooking the dark stretch of gardens, the soft hum of distant conversation barely reaching him as a cool breeze moved through the open space, carrying with it the faint scent of cut grass and evening air. And for the first time all day there was nothing demanding his attention, nothing requiring his control, nothing except the quiet persistence of a thought he could not shake. Because the more he replayed the evening, the more the details refused to settle into something simple. Olivia's words, her reactions, the way she seemed to know things she should not. And it was not enough to dismiss it as coincidence anymore. Not when every instinct he trusted was telling him there was something just out of reach, something he had seen before but could not fully recall. And behind him the soft sound of footsteps broke through his thoughts, measured, unhurried. And he did not need to turn to know it was her, because there was already a familiarity in her presence that felt strangely grounding despite everything else. "You disappeared," Olivia said lightly as she stepped beside him, her gaze moving out over the same quiet landscape, and Ethan exhaled slowly, his hands resting against the cool stone railing. "I needed a moment." he replied, his voice lower now, less guarded than it had been all day. And for a few seconds neither of them spoke, the silence settling comfortably between them, not empty, but full of something unspoken, something waiting. And then Ethan turned slightly toward her, his expression thoughtful, searching in a way that made his usual certainty feel distant. "Have we met before?" he asked, the question simple but carrying a weight that shifted the air between them instantly. And Olivia's breath caught almost imperceptibly, a reaction so brief it could have been missed by anyone else, but not by him. Because he was watching too closely now, listening too carefully, and for a moment she did not answer. Her eyes focused on the garden as if considering how much of the truth belonged in this moment. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm but softer than before. "Why would you think that?" she asked, not denying, not confirming, just redirecting. And Ethan studied her, the faint glow of the terrace lights catching the edges of her expression, revealing just enough to deepen his curiosity. "Because you do not react like someone who is seeing all of this for the first time," he said, gesturing lightly toward the house behind them, toward the world she had stepped into so seamlessly. "And because there are things you say, details you notice, that feel familiar," he added, the last word lingering as if he was testing it for truth. And Olivia finally turned to face him fully, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that held both honesty and restraint at once. "Maybe familiarity does not always come from memory," she said quietly. "Sometimes it comes from understanding." And her answer should have been enough. It was logical, composed, exactly the kind of response that kept boundaries intact, but instead it only deepened the space between what he knew and what he felt, because something about the way she said it carried more than explanation. It carried history. And as they stood there under the dim evening lights, the quiet stretching just long enough to become something significant, Ethan Carter realized that whatever this connection was, it was no longer something he could categorize or control, and for the first time since this arrangement began, he found himself not trying to solve it, but wanting to understand it, even if the answer would change everything he thought he knew about her, and perhaps about himself as well. The next morning did not arrive gently. It arrived with expectation, with movement, with the kind of polished urgency that filled every corner of the Carter estate as staff moved with quiet precision and family members shifted into roles that had been rehearsed long before this day. And Olivia Bennet stood near the tall windows of the guest suite assigned to her, watching the early lights stretch across the grounds, her reflection faint against the glass, composed, steady, almost indistinguishable from the version of herself she had presented the day before. And yet something inside her had shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to feel the weight of it, because the lines she had carefully maintained were beginning to blur in ways she could not fully control. And behind her the door opened softly, the subtle sound enough to pull her attention back. And Ethan stepped inside without hesitation, his presence filling the room in that quiet, controlled way that seemed effortless to him, dressed already for the day ahead, every detail precise, every movement intentional, except for the way his eyes settled on her immediately, not assessing, not calculating, but searching, as if the conversation from the night before had followed him into the morning without pause. "We have a rehearsal in an hour," he said, his tone even but carrying an undercurrent of something unspoken. And Olivia nodded, turning fully toward him. "I will be ready," she replied, her voice steady. But there was a brief pause after, a moment where neither of them moved, neither of them filled the space with anything unnecessary. And then Ethan stepped closer, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to shift the atmosphere between them into something more personal, more focused. "You never answered my question," he said quietly, his gaze holding hers with a level of intent that made avoidance feel almost impossible. And Olivia felt it again, that familiar tension between truth and protection, between what could be said and what needed to remain unsaid. And for a second she considered deflecting again, maintaining the boundary they had both agreed to. But something in his expression, something in the quiet persistence of his attention made that feel insufficient. "Not every question has a simple answer," she said softly, choosing her words carefully, and Ethan did not look away, did not step back. He simply studied her as if he was trying to read between every word she did not say. And before either of them could continue, the moment was interrupted by a knock at the door, light but purposeful, and when it opened without waiting for permission, Sophia stepped in with the same composed confidence she had carried the day before, her presence immediate, deliberate, her eyes moving from Ethan to Olivia with a subtle awareness that suggested she had already read more than either of them intended to show. "I hope I am not interrupting," she said smoothly, though her tone suggested she knew exactly when to arrive, exactly what to disrupt, and Ethan straightened slightly, the shift back into control almost automatic. "We were just about to head down," he replied, his voice returning to its usual composure, and Sophia's smile remained perfectly measured as she stepped further into the room, her attention settling briefly on Olivia. "I thought it might be helpful to review a few details before everything begins," she said, her words polite but layered with implication, and Olivia understood immediately. This was not assistance. This was another test, another attempt to find the edge where she might falter, and for a brief moment the room felt smaller, the air sharper. But Olivia did not retreat, did not hesitate. She simply met Sophia's gaze with the same calm confidence she had carried since the beginning. "That sounds like a good idea," she replied evenly, and as the three of them stood there, the quiet tension settling just beneath the surface, Ethan realized something with a clarity he could no longer ignore. This was no longer just about maintaining appearances. This was becoming something else entirely, something layered, something personal. And as he glanced between the two women, one representing a past he had already defined, the other a presence he was only beginning to understand, he felt the balance of control shift. Again, because for the first time in a long time, he was not entirely sure which direction the outcome would take, and that uncertainty was beginning to matter more than he expected. Pressure does not always arrive as confrontation. Sometimes it settles quietly into a room and waits for the smallest crack to appear, and as the rehearsal began in the late morning light, Olivia Bennet felt that pressure not from the obvious places, but from the subtle shifts around her. The way conversations paused half a second longer when she approached. The way glances lingered just enough to signal curiosity turning into quiet judgment. And at the center of it all stood Sophia, composed, attentive, moving through the space with effortless authority as if she had never left it, guiding details, correcting minor arrangements, offering suggestions that sounded helpful, but carried an edge that made it clear she was still very much a part of this world. And Olivia understood immediately. This was not about the wedding. This was about positioning, about reminding everyone exactly where each person stood, and more importantly, where they did not. And when the group gathered near the aisle for a walkthrough of the ceremony, Sophia's voice carried lightly over the others, suggesting a minor change in pairing. A small adjustment that would place Olivia slightly behind Ethan rather than beside him, subtle enough to seem insignificant, deliberate enough to shift perception. And for a brief moment, all eyes turned, waiting, measuring, expecting compliance, expecting hesitation, expecting something that would confirm the narrative already forming in quiet corners. And Olivia felt that moment stretch, the weight of it pressing just enough to test her balance. But instead of stepping back, she moved forward, her posture calm, her expression unchanged as she took her place exactly where she had been before, beside Ethan, not in defiance, not in confrontation, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understood her position did not need to be granted by anyone else. And the silence that followed was brief but telling, because it disrupted the expectation without creating a scene, and Ethan noticed it instantly. The way she held her ground without escalation, the way she navigated the moment without giving Sophia anything to push against. And something in him shifted again, this time more clearly, more decisively, because what he was witnessing was not performance. It was character, it was instinct, it was something real that could not be taught or arranged. And as the rehearsal continued, the tension did not disappear, it simply changed form, becoming quieter, more strategic. And when a family friend made an offhand comment about how quickly things seemed to have moved between Ethan and Olivia, the tone light, but the implication clear, Olivia did not hesitate, did not stumble. She simply smiled and responded with an ease that disarmed the question before it could settle. "Sometimes the right timing does not feel rushed, it feels overdue," she said, her voice soft but confident, and the effect was immediate. The comment dissolved into a ripple of agreement, the focus shifting away from scrutiny and back into the flow of the event, and across the space Sophia watched, her expression still composed, but her eyes sharper now, more focused. Because the pattern was becoming undeniable, Olivia was not slipping, she was not faltering. She was adapting, holding, responding in ways that made it harder and harder to define her as anything less than exactly what she appeared to be. And as the rehearsal drew to a close and people began to disperse, Ethan found himself standing beside Olivia again, closer than before, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You are not just following the plan anymore," he said, not as an accusation, not as a question, but as an observation that carried something deeper beneath it. And Olivia glanced at him briefly, a faint, almost knowing smile touching her expression. "Maybe the plan was never as simple as you thought," she replied, and as she stepped away to speak with someone else, leaving him standing there with that thought lingering in the space between them, Ethan Carter realized that whatever control he believed he had at the beginning of this arrangement had already begun to slip, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily enough that ignoring it was no longer an option, because this was no longer just a role being played. This was becoming a story that neither of them had fully written, and the next part of it was no longer entirely his to decide. Truth does not always arrive as a revelation. Sometimes it builds quietly until it can no longer be ignored. And for Ethan Carter, that moment came not in the middle of a conversation or under the scrutiny of others, but in a space where no one else was watching. As the afternoon faded into early evening and the estate settled into a brief pause before the wedding ceremony would begin, and he found himself walking through the side corridor that led toward the older wing of the house, a place he had not visited in years, drawn there not by intention but by something deeper, something unsettled that had been building since the night before. And as he stepped into the quiet hallway lined with framed photographs, memories captured in still moments from a life that once felt simpler, his gaze moved absent-mindedly from one image to the next until it stopped, not gradually, not with hesitation, but instantly, as if something had reached out and held his attention in place. And there it was. A photograph taken years ago at the lake house his uncle had mentioned. The early morning light reflected across the water, just as Olivia had described, and standing at the edge of the dock was a younger version of himself, less composed, less guarded, his posture relaxed in a way that no longer came naturally, and beside him, slightly turned away from the camera, was a girl, her face not fully visible, but her presence unmistakable, because even without seeing her clearly, there was something in the way she stood, something in the way the moment had been captured that felt achingly familiar, and Ethan stepped closer, his eyes narrowing slightly as he searched his memory, pulling at fragments that had long been buried under years of decisions and distance. And then it came, not as a sudden flash, but as a quiet unfolding, a memory of a summer he had almost forgotten, a time before everything had become structured and controlled, when he had met someone unexpected at that very lake, a girl who had spoken with the same calm certainty, who had noticed the same details others overlooked, who had made him feel, even briefly, like he did not have to be anything more than himself. And the realization settled slowly but with undeniable weight, because the connection he had been searching for was not imagined. It was real. It had always been real, and he had simply failed to recognize it until now. And as he stood there, the silence of the hallway pressing in around him, the pieces aligned in a way that left no room for doubt. Olivia Bennett was not just someone who felt familiar. She was someone he had already known, someone who had been part of a moment in his life he had never expected to revisit. And the implications of that truth shifted everything. Not just the arrangement, not just the carefully constructed boundaries they had agreed upon, but the meaning behind every interaction, every word, every unspoken understanding that had felt too natural to question. And as Ethan exhaled slowly, his hand resting briefly against the frame of the photograph, he understood something with a clarity that left no space for uncertainty. This was no longer a situation he could treat as temporary, no longer something he could control through logic or distance, because whatever had begun between them was rooted in something far deeper than coincidence. And as he turned away from the photograph, already moving with a sense of purpose that had not been there before, one thought remained clear above all. Others, he was not going to let her walk away again without knowing the truth, no matter what it changed, no matter what it cost, because some connections, once remembered, could not be ignored. There are moments when a choice no longer feels like a decision but like an inevitability, and as the wedding ceremony began beneath a soft canopy of white flowers and golden evening light, Ethan Carter stood at the front beside his sister, but his focus was not on the music, not on the guests taking their seats, not even on the carefully orchestrated sequence of events unfolding exactly as planned, because his attention was fixed on one person walking toward him down the aisle, Olivia Bennet, moving with calm, steady grace, her expression composed, yet carrying something deeper beneath the surface, something he now understood in a way he had not allowed himself to before. And with every step she took, the distance between them felt heavier, not physically but emotionally, because what had once been a simple arrangement had become something layered with meaning he could no longer ignore. And when she reached his side and took her place beside him, their eyes met briefly. And in that single glance there was a shift, subtle but undeniable, because he was no longer looking at her as someone fulfilling a role. He was looking at her as someone he had already known, someone he had once met without expectation, without conditions, and that realization carried a weight that changed everything about this moment. And as the ceremony began and the officiant's voice filled the air, speaking about commitment and trust and the significance of choosing someone not just in the easy moments, but in the uncertain ones, Ethan found himself no longer listening to the words as part of the event, but feeling them as something personal, something directed at him in a way he had not anticipated. Because for the first time in a long time he was being confronted not by external expectations, but by his own understanding of what mattered. And beside him Olivia remained steady, her presence quiet yet grounding. But there was a distance in her composure now, a careful restraint that had not been there before, as if she had already begun to step back emotionally even while standing right next to him. And that shift did not go unnoticed. It settled into him with a clarity that sharpened his thoughts. Because if there was one thing he understood with certainty now, it was that this was not something he could allow to end as a transaction, not when it had already become something real, something rooted in a connection neither of them had planned but both had felt. And as the ceremony reached its midpoint and the guests watched with quiet attention, Ethan made a decision that no longer felt like a risk, but like the only possible path forward. And without waiting for the perfect moment, without calculating the outcome the way he always did, he turned slightly toward Olivia, his voice low but steady enough to carry just between them. "This was never supposed to be real," he said, the words simple but carrying the weight of everything he had come to understand. And Olivia's breath caught almost imperceptibly as she looked at him, her composure faltering just enough to reveal the truth she had been holding back. And for a moment the world around them seemed to fade, the ceremony continuing, but no longer the center of his focus, because the only thing that mattered now was the space between them, the unspoken history that had finally surfaced, and the choice that stood clearly in front of him, not as a calculation, not as a contract, but as something far more personal, far more important. And as he held her gaze, the certainty in his expression replacing the controlled distance he had carried for so long, Ethan Carter knew that whatever happened next would define not just this moment, but everything that came after, because for the first time he was not choosing what was expected, he was choosing what was true. There are moments when truth demands to be spoken not later, not in private, not when it is convenient, but exactly when it risks everything. And as Ethan Carter held Olivia's gaze in the middle of a ceremony that was never meant to belong to them, he understood that waiting would only return them to the same distance they had already crossed once before, and that was something he was no longer willing to accept, because the memory he had uncovered, the connection he now recognized, had shifted. The meaning of every second they had spent together, and it was no longer enough to feel it quietly. It had to be acknowledged, fully and without condition, and Olivia saw it in his expression before he even spoke again. The difference, the certainty, the absence of hesitation that had defined him before, replaced now with something far more honest, far more vulnerable, and it unsettled her in a way she had tried to avoid. Since the moment she agreed to this arrangement, because she had always known the truth carried risk, not just of being revealed, but of being felt, and she had not come here expecting either, And yet here it was, standing between them, undeniable and impossible to ignore. You were there, Ethan said quietly, his voice steady but carrying the weight of realization. At the lake, years ago. And the words landed not as a question but as a confirmation, and for a moment Olivia did not respond, her composure holding just long enough to show that she had always known this moment might come, that recognition was only a matter of time. And when she finally spoke, her voice was softer, no longer guarded in the same way. I wondered how long it would take you, she admitted. And there it was, the truth no longer hidden behind careful answers or controlled distance. And something in Ethan's expression shifted again, not with surprise, but with understanding, because the missing piece had been found. And with it came the realization of everything that had been left unfinished, everything that had been walked away from without intention or closure. And the space between them changed once more, no longer defined by uncertainty, but by the weight of what had been rediscovered. And around them the ceremony continued, the guests unaware of the quiet turning point unfolding just beyond their attention. But for Ethan and Olivia the moment had narrowed into something far more personal, something that demanded clarity. Why did you not tell me? He asked, not accusing, not frustrated, but searching, and Olivia met his gaze fully now, her eyes steady, honest in a way they had not been before. Because you did not remember, she said simply. And I was not going to build something on a memory that only belonged to me. And her words carried a quiet strength that settled deeply, because they revealed not just the truth of their past, but the reason she had held herself back, the reason she had maintained the boundaries even as they blurred, and Ethan understood it instantly. The restraint, the choice to let him find the connection on his own rather than force it into something one-sided. And in that understanding came something else, something stronger than recognition, respect. And as he looked at her now, truly looked at her without the filter of expectation or assumption, he saw not just who she had been in that distant memory, but who she was now. Someone who had stood beside him without needing to prove anything. Someone who had met every challenge without losing herself. And someone who had chosen honesty even when it meant stepping away. And that was the moment the decision became complete, not as a reaction, not as an impulse, but as something fully realized. And as the officiant's voice continued in the background, speaking about promises and commitment, Ethan turned slightly toward Olivia, his expression clear, unwavering. Then let us not leave it unfinished again, he said, the words quiet but carrying a certainty that reached beyond the moment, beyond the contract, beyond everything they had agreed this would be. And in that instant the line between what was planned and what was real disappeared completely, replaced by something neither of them had expected, but both now understood they could no longer walk away from. Some endings are not quiet, they are declarations. And as the final words of the ceremony drifted through the air, Ethan Carter stepped forward in a way that shifted the moment entirely, not away from the wedding that surrounded them, but into something that belonged unmistakably to him and Olivia alone, his hand reaching for hers not as part of the role they had been playing, but with a certainty that needed no rehearsal, no agreement, no contract. And when he turned fully toward her, the subtle murmur among the guests began to rise. Confusion mixing with curiosity as the change in atmosphere became impossible to ignore. But Ethan did not look at them, did not acknowledge the attention or the expectation, because for the first time he was not performing for anyone else. He was choosing something for himself, and more importantly, for her. This was supposed to end after today, he said, his voice steady, clear enough to carry beyond just the two of them now, not loud, not dramatic, but grounded in a truth that did not need emphasis. And Olivia felt the shift instantly, the weight of the moment settling around them as every eye turned in their direction, every conversation falling into silence. And for a brief second she hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of the understanding that this was no longer contained, no longer protected by the boundaries they had set. This was real in a way that could not be undone, and Ethan saw that hesitation, not as resistance, but as the final distance between what had been and what could be, and he closed it without hesitation. But I am not ending it, he continued, his gaze never leaving hers, because this was never just an arrangement, not for me, not anymore. And the simplicity of those words carried more weight than any elaborate explanation could have, because They were not built on obligation or expectation. They were built on choice. And Olivia's breath caught softly as the reality of what he was saying settled in. Not just the words themselves, but everything behind them. The recognition, the respect, the willingness to stand in front of everyone and redefine the narrative completely. And for a moment the world around them seemed suspended, the wedding, the guests, the carefully planned structure of the day all fading into the background as something far more personal took its place. And then Ethan did something that removed any remaining doubt. He reached into his jacket and took out the small velvet box that had once symbolized a contract, opening it slowly as he held it between them, the ring inside catching the light just as it had the day they signed the agreement. But now it carried an entirely different meaning, and his voice, though still calm, held something deeper now, something that could not be mistaken for anything less than real. This started as something temporary, he said. But I am asking you to make it permanent, not because of what we agreed to, but because of who you are, and who we are together. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with the weight of expectation, of possibility, of a future that had not been part of any plan. And Olivia looked at him, truly looked at him without the need to guard herself anymore. And in that moment, everything aligned. The past she had carried quietly, the present they had navigated carefully, and the future now standing clearly in front of her, not as a risk, but as a choice. And slowly, without hesitation, she smiled, not the controlled composure she had held for days, but something genuine, something warm, something entirely her own. And as she placed her hand in his again, this time without any pretense, the quiet certainty of her answer was reflected in her eyes before she even spoke, and when she did, her voice was soft but unwavering. I am not walking away this time, she said. And in that moment the story they had stepped into as strangers pretending to belong became something else entirely, something real, something chosen. And as the room finally exhaled into applause, into warmth, into acceptance, Ethan Carter understood that for the first time he had not just built something successful, he had found something meaningful, and that was a kind of certainty no contract could ever define.